and many other... Hello and welcome to WION Live, broadcast from London. I'm Ollie Barrett, and coming up we've got the latest on the world's top stories, including breaking news out of the UK on that investigation into parties in and around Downing Street. These are the other headlines. Beijing records its highest number of COVID-19 cases for a year and a half as the Chinese capital gears up to host the Winter Olympics in 5 days. The UN Security Council is due to hold a key meeting on Ukraine later. Sources suggest the Russian lower house could take a decision on the recognition of the Donbas Republic, Ukraine's breakaway region, on February the 14th, further escalating tensions with the West. Protesters continue to gather in Ottawa a day after thousands descended on Canada's capital city to protest against Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and COVID-19 vaccine mandates. The UAE destroys a Houthi missile launch site in northern Yemen after the rebel group fired a third ballistic missile in a month, which the UAE intercepted and destroyed. And a United Nations report claims the Taliban has killed more than 100 former Afghan government members, security personnel and people who worked with international forces since it seized Kabul in August last year. And we will begin with that breaking news out of the UK. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been handed an update on the investigation into parties in and around Downing Street. Brief statement from the Cabinet Office in the last few moments saying, "We can confirm that Sue Gray has provided an update on her investigations to the Prime Minister." Sue Gray is the senior civil servant who had been tasked by Boris Johnson with looking into a series of claimed parties in and around Downing Street over the last 2 years, some of which may have broken COVID-19 lockdown regulations. The process was thrown up in the air somewhat last week when the police announced they would also be launching their own investigation and asked Sue Gray not to publish full details about the events that they are looking into, which may have seen some illegality involved. So how we expect all of this to play out now is that Boris Johnson has a reduced report of some sort from Sue Gray. We expect him to head to the House of Commons in London later today to give a statement and answer questions from MPs. The Prime Minister is expected to apologise. Again, we also expect that he will suggest that his Downing Street staff could be changed as a response to the report that he's received from Sue Gray, which we believe could be critical of the Prime Minister and his Downing Street operation. It is also expected that Boris Johnson will signal some further policy moves to his backbench MPs to try and win over their support. But Boris Johnson will still have that police investigation hanging over him and his government, which could take weeks, if not months. The opposition Labour Party have continued to call for Boris Johnson to resign. One of the key issues that they will be expected to press Boris Johnson on in the Commons later is whether Boris Johnson misled the House of Commons with previous statements about parties in and around Downing Street. That would normally be considered a resignation matter. But behind the scenes, Boris Johnson has been working furiously with MPs who support him to try and solidify his position and head off a leadership challenge. If, though, Sue Gray's update means that more Conservative MPs do send in letters to that so-called 1922 Conservative Committee, and if 54 of those letters go in, then a confidence vote would still be triggered. So that is still very much possible. But Boris Johnson will try and use today as an opportunity to attempt to move on and show that his government can focus on other things while also accepting some responsibility and apologising for what may or may not have taken place in and around Downing Street with regards to COVID-19 breaches over the last couple of years. So just to confirm that update, we have heard from the Cabinet Office here in London that Sue Gray, that civil servant who's been looking into parties, has provided an update on her investigations to the Prime Minister. We therefore expect to hear from the Prime Minister in the House of Commons as soon as in the coming hours. And next, Beijing, where the Winter Olympics are due to begin in just 3 days. But an increasing number of COVID-19 infections have put authorities in China on high alert. China's detected 37 new coronavirus cases among people linked to the Games. 28 of the new cases were people who tested positive after arriving at the airport. In the last 4 days, China's detected over 100 COVID-19 cases among people linked to the Games. Some 3,000 athletes, along with coaches, officials, referees, federation delegates and media, are expected for the Olympics. Participants, staff and media are operating in a closed-loop bubble. That loop permits participants to move freely between the accommodation and Olympic venues on official transport. However, they are not allowed to move freely in public. Olympic athletes and others must fly directly into Beijing on charter flights. Everyone directly involved in the Games, including the media and other staff, is being tested daily. On Sunday, the host city reported its highest number of new COVID cases since June 2020. 2 million residents of the district where they were found are already being tested for COVID-19. Authorities in Beijing have locked down some housing compounds. The upcoming Lunar New Year, which is China's biggest national holiday, also presents a major challenge as millions of people return to their hometowns. Our correspondent Patrick Fock sent us this report from Beijing.
Well, in one sense, no doubt the hosts will be somewhat concerned, given that the 37 cases that were reported represents the highest daily count there's been since people started arriving in Beijing for the Games. But at the same time, the IOC did say that it expected those numbers to peak over these few days. Remember, this is when the bulk of athletes and other participants are arriving in Beijing ahead of the opening ceremony on Friday. So in that sense, this perhaps doesn't come as much of a surprise. As far as we understand, there are somewhere between 200 to 250 people that have tested positive after landing here in China, but we only know of one athlete that has been ruled out after testing positive twice here in China. That's a Russian biathlete. So you might imagine that the IOC and the organisers of the Games are actually quite relieved about how things are going right now. That aside, the situation in the capital is easing. There have been fewer cases to emerge over the last few days, and there haven't been any added restrictions put in place to prevent people from going home for the Lunar New Year holidays. And remember, the priority for Beijing is not to make sure that the Games stay safe, but also to ensure that there isn't any leak outside of the closed-loop management system that turns into an outbreak into the Chinese public.
The United States and Britain are stepping up efforts to keep Moscow under pressure over Ukraine. Both countries are preparing new sanctions against people and businesses linked to the Kremlin. US senators say they are very close to reaching a deal on measures, some of which could take effect before any invasion of Ukraine.
U.S. senators are very close to reaching a deal on legislation to sanction Russia over its actions regarding Ukraine, including some measures that may take effect before any invasion, two leading senators said on Sunday. Senators Bob Menendez, the Democratic chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and James Risch, the committee's top Republican, said they hope to move forward on the bill this week. Menendez added that there is strong bipartisan resolve to support Ukraine and punish Russia if it invades. Russia has been building up its forces on Ukraine's borders for months and has demanded NATO pull troops and weapons from Eastern Europe and bar Ukraine from ever joining the U.S.-led military alliance. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky supports immediate action and has criticized the West for waiting to impose more damaging sanctions. The U.S. Senate bill would target the most significant Russian banks and Russian sovereign debt, as well as provide more U.S. military assistance to Ukraine. Menendez said that some of the sanctions could take effect before any invasion by Russia because of what Moscow has already done, including cyber attacks on Ukraine and efforts to undermine the Ukrainian government internally. Meanwhile, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson on Sunday tweeted that the situation is increasingly concerning and urged Russia to engage in negotiations. Johnson said he has ordered British armed forces to prepare to deploy across Europe next week to support NATO allies. The Prime Minister is also due to visit the region this week and will speak by phone to Russian President Vladimir Putin.
Years of fighting have left the residents of Nevelsky, a village near the front lines in East Ukraine, without running water and electricity. The village had around 300 inhabitants 20 years ago, but most have now fled. Only 5 remain.
Elderly couple Katrina and Dmytro Shklaya are among the last residents of Nevelsk. The village is near the front lines in Ukraine's east, where years of fighting have left them without running water, electricity or neighbours. The Shklayas rely on the Ukrainian military and aid workers to deliver basic goods. Their neighbourhood is mostly made up of destroyed houses.
It can't get any worse. Nothing can be worse than this. If it could be worse, it would. It's as bad as it can be. How can one survive like this? He's 86 and I'm 76 years old, and we live having nothing. Well, we have, of course, our own potatoes, carrots and onions, but that's all we have.
Nevelsk sits some 15 miles from Donetsk, the biggest city in the contested Ukrainian region where Russia has backed separatist rebels fighting government troops since 2014. The conflict has killed 15,000 people to date. As it stands, the Shklaya's nearest shop is too risky to reach across military roadblocks. The largely dormant but still dangerous line separating Ukraine from the territory is currently under rebel control. 20 years ago, Nevelsk had some 300 inhabitants, but most have fled. Now, after the latest shelling in November, only 5 people still live here. A little food cellar where the couple keep jars of pickled fruit and vegetables also serves as their bomb shelter. A cat and a dog are all the company they have left.
Everybody has left this place. Those who had money and could afford to buy something somewhere else, all left. And where would we go? 2 old people. Who needs us? Where can we hide? You better shoot us.
Russia has spooked Ukraine and the West in recent weeks by massing some 120,000 troops near its border. It annexed Crimea from Ukraine in 2014, and the West has threatened Moscow with grave sanctions if it invades again, something Russia has repeatedly denied it plans to do.
Next, the United States has denounced Pyongyang's latest missile test. It's a record-breaking 7th missile launch in a month by North Korea. Pyongyang has now tested its most powerful missile since 2017. Washington is concerned it could escalate to resumed tests of nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles. A senior US official has urged Pyongyang to join direct talks with no preconditions. The official said the latest test was part of an increasingly destabilising pattern and said it was in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. North Korea's state news agency KCNA said it was a Hwasong-12 intermediate-range ballistic missile that was tested. Pyongyang's previously claimed the Hwasong-12 could carry a large-size heavy nuclear warhead. The missile is estimated to have reached an altitude of 2,000 kilometres. The test warhead was fitted with a camera that took photos while it was in space. The images released by state media show space-based pictures of North Korea and the surrounding area. South Korean President Moon Jae-in says this month's flurry of missile tests is reminiscent of heightened tensions in 2017. That was when North Korea conducted multiple nuclear tests. Seoul has warned that nuclear and long-range tests could be next and that Pyongyang could be closer to fully scrapping a self-imposed moratorium, which had included a stop on testing longest-range ICBMs and nuclear weapons tests. The North Korean leader Kim Jong-un says the United States and its allies have shown no sign of dropping what he calls their hostile policies. Under President Joe Biden, Washington has repeatedly sought talks with North Korea, but those attempts have been rebuffed. WION correspondent Phoebe Amoroso sent this report from Tokyo.
Well, the latest launch certainly is raising concerns that it's edging closer to breaking that moratorium on intercontinental ballistic missiles and also nuclear tests. In fact, some analysts would say that this is already showing signs that it has completely scrapped that. So this latest missile is much longer range than the previous 6 launches we saw this month, flying around 800 kilometers, reaching a maximum altitude of around 2,000 kilometers. North Korean state media has said that it was deliberately launched at a high angle in order to protect the surrounding nation's security. And that they managed to take photos, as we've all seen from space, of the launch. However, it does seem that the North is very keen to keep upping the pace of testing. And the big question is, what will be the response from the United States and from other countries?
Next, we will go to South Africa, which has one of the highest levels of violence against women on earth. More than 100 rapes are reported daily. According to official data, on average, a woman is murdered every 3 hours. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has characterised violence against women as a second pandemic in the country, along with COVID-19.
It took this woman 10 years to escape her violent husband, but not before he broke her ribs with an iron bar. Today she lives in a shelter in Johannesburg for abused women. She urges other victims of domestic violence to speak up, faster than she did.
Every woman having boundaries, have a way to say no, and seek help as much as you can while it's still early, and while you're still alive, and while you're still breathing.
South Africa has some of the world's highest levels of violence against women. More than 100 rapes are reported each day. On average, a woman is murdered every 3 hours, according to official figures. And these rates went up during the COVID-19 lockdowns. Many women were trapped at home with their abusers.
These women are just not statistics.
President Cyril Ramaphosa compared the violence to a second pandemic in a nationally televised address.
As a man, as a husband, and as a father to daughters, I am appalled at what is no less than a war that is being waged against the women and the children of our country.
South Africa has only 100 shelters like this to protect women. Some receive very little public funding. Often, the victim takes the blame when they speak out, says Seema Jai, who runs the Nisa shelter for women in Johannesburg.
They would often say, but you stayed in 20 years, you didn't say anything, you didn't do anything, so why change it now?
On the other side of the country, over the last 2 years, more and more women came knocking on the door of this Cape Town refuge.
Before I moved from the house, he drove to the beach and told me that, look, this is where I'm going to end your life, here. Nobody's leaving me and no one is going to find you here. So that's why I chose this spot. For me to lay a charge for him, I don't see a reason, because 2 weeks' time or a month' time, he's out.
Joy Lang, manager of the St Anne's home in Cape Town, says police are often unhelpful.
Women still complain about the treatment and the non-responsiveness of the South African police. And I think that also links to patriarchy that is still very deep-rooted in our country and that needs to be looked at seriously.
In September, the Parliament passed 3 bills to tighten laws on gender-based violence. Activists say it doesn't address the root causes. South African men often grow up without fathers. Abusers often are the survivors of childhood abuse themselves.
After a hiatus last year due to the COVID-19 pandemic, tourists are coming back into San Francisco's Chinatown to celebrate the Lunar New Year this year. The festival started on Saturday with a flower market fair and a mini parade, and the community in San Francisco is banking on this year's celebration.
It's really exciting, and it's also just really heartwarming, and it's long overdue. I think people are really just excited and can't wait for life to come back to normal. So in a way, this is hopefully a kickoff for that, for some normalcy, and of course Chinese New Year, Lunar New Year.
Since the pandemic, no one has really stepped outside of their house. And this year, finally, after vaccinations and all of that, people are starting to come out a bit. And like you see here, like people are starting to come in here a lot more than last year. And so that's a very good thing.
And that's all we have on today's WION Live broadcast from London. Do stay tuned to WION. World is one.
There are many other...